Okay, guys, thanks for joining this podcast. Welcome. I thought we could start by just talking about the current market for esports and projected growth. And Hugo, maybe you could kick it off because I know a couple of months ago, you actually, for Newzoo, wrote a specific report about the growth of the esports market.
Yeah, that's a quite interesting question, and I think esport audience is the most important asset for esports. And in our last report, we forecast that the esport audience will grow by 640 million by the end of 2025, and for 2022 year will be 532 million people, and the CAGR for that will be 8% from 2020 to 2025. But also, we split the esport audience into occasional viewers, those who watch sport less than once a month. So you can think about those who watch, uh, let's say, like the big international tournaments, and we have esport enthusiasts, those who watch esport content more than once a month, right? But okay, it's not only about the audience itself. I think when you talk about esports, everyone wants to know about okay, how much money is in the industry, and we expect by the end of 2022, esports will generate nearly 1.4 billion dollars, and by the end of 2025, that number will be nearly 1.9 billion, with a healthy CAGR of like 30.4%.
Got it.
That's pretty much the scope of the industry, Joseph.
Got it. So, okay, just to be clear, like the first number, 8% was like the user growth, and then the other numbers are more around the revenue growth, right?
Yeah, the the first number definitely it's the esport audience growth, so
Mhm.
people who watch esports,
Right,
and the second one is the revenue generated by esports.
right. So maybe we could actually dive into that a little bit in terms of how the revenue is generated. I know, Ilaria, with your experience previously at EA, could you maybe speak to like how does this kind of system work? Like, where does the money get generated in esports? Is it by the there's teams, there's the companies, there's the publishers and things of that nature, and like how does all of the financials and the economics work?
Sure. So I'm still at EA because you said
Yeah,
previously.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
you
yeah.
mentioned,
I mean,
but
when you previously worked on in an esports
esports,
capacity. Yeah.
yeah, and it's been eye opening in many ways. It's a whole world where it's a whole ecosystem, I would say, where the publisher, teams, professional teams, amateur players who want to become professional, sponsors, broadcasters, they all come together. So obviously, the bigger is the publisher, the more money can pump into it, right? The idea is whether you're constructing a whole tournament or a whole season, the idea is still the same. So the revenue will come from either sponsors, if you're doing a live event, which we haven't done, like live in person, which we haven't done in 2 years, but we're doing now. But if you're doing a live event in some arena, obviously you're going to be selling tickets, you're going to be selling merch, you're going to be selling a lot of things. So that adds to it. But otherwise, the money will come mostly from sponsorships. And if your commercial team is able to repackage that as a product that can go even on linear television. So you can see, in fact, there are channels dedicated to it, just to esports. But you can also see fragments of esports tournaments on ESPN, for example. And that's because the interest is so much now with making, stars out of your professional players and a whole ecosystem around them. So there's a whole economy even around them with their own social media managers. The teams come with their PR person. So it is at that point, and their own sponsors. So all the money sort of comes together from this ecosystem. I would say, long story short, there isn't one single source of revenue. And as we see this market increasing, as Hugo was saying, we will see more and more possibility to also repackage what you have. So the revenue doesn't end there with the event, but it continues and creates a whole channel that goes on even on linear television, and obviously Twitch, YouTube, main channels
Got it.
online.
I would also add just, and I was a client of Newzoo for like 5 or 6 years in my prior job. And I love the research. And it's, I think it's also important to remember for those that don't know that what's not counted in your market size, because you're kind of counting direct revenue, is the revenue from games that wouldn't exist without esports. Think of a game like League of Legends, right? I mean, that generates what, $2 to $3 billion a year of revenue, whatever the number is. How much of that is because they have such a successful esports, ecosystem around it that drives interest and drives engagement and drives revenue in the game. And so, when you start to think about kind of this second order and third order tertiary effects of esports on the broader gaming industry, the numbers also do get a lot bigger when you look at games like, Honor of Kings in China or Free Fire, the mobile game, right? All of these games, their success is partially predicated by the fact that they develop such a strong esports ecosystem around them. And I don't think you can just kind of, they've been successful because of lots of reasons. Esports is definitely one of the key reasons.
Right. And so, as you mentioned, League of Legends, what about for our audience? What are the other games they should be aware of that have done a good job in terms of integrating esports? Hugo, I'm not sure if you looked at any specific games, or Matthew, if you're aware of like good examples, maybe both on the on the PC, console, or mobile side.
Uh, yeah, I think that's quite interesting question, and I think I would also complementary what Matthew said
Mhm.
before. So, because esports is such a really good tool for publishers to keep community engaged. So when you look to okay, what games are doing well in esports, it's for when you look for some for PC games, which is a much more, let's say, older industry than the mobile
Mhm.
games. You pretty much will find out that the games that have esports are lasting much longer than the other games. So you can think about like League of Legends, Dota 2, Counter Strike, Rainbow Six, and recently Rocket League. So I would say those are the major games that has some kind of like global esports ecosystem. Because if we dive into like regionals, that we will find out that some games are performing better or only perform in that specific region. But for a global scope, I would say that are the PC games. But also when we look to specifically to mobile, and mobile is a trend that we start seeing from 2018. We find out that we have like Garena Free Fire, we have PUBG Mobile, we have Arena of Valor, and we have Mobile Legends Bank Bank, and more recently we have League of Legends Wild Rift. I would say if you ask me what would be the like the most important uh, esport titles, I would be focused on those.
Got it. And when we think about the kinds of games that esports is good for, would you say there are certain characteristics or genres? I mean, I assume it's games that are higher skill cap, which would also not only dictate like a specific kind of gameplay, but also potentially like would then favor PC over mobile or things like that. But would you guys agree with that, or how would you characterize the kinds of games that are better adapted for esports?
I think overall, I think what we've just seen that's been so successful is games that, whether it's PC, console, or mobile, they're games that are consumable in little bits. So if you think about like, a sports game from EA, or, even Call of Duty, or Counter Strike, right? Where you have rounds where, because it's a broadcast, right? You're able to kind of, there's a break, the commentators can do analysis, and then there's more action, and it's kind of, it has that normal flow of traditional sports. And I think those are the genres that we've seen that have done relatively well in esports, at least from the broadcasting side of it, because it lends itself well to that nature of varying it live, whereas something that's, you know even like Dota's like kind of, in League of Legends, like if you ever watch them, like the first 20 minutes is kind of like
It's all the
kind of
build up.
boring of every
Yeah.
round, and then the action starts, and so you can kind of tune in 20 minutes late and you just miss all of like the leveling up and prep work, and then people start actually doing cool stuff. And so, I think some of these other genres, are slightly better tuned, and that's why you've seen, whether it's Activision with the Call of Duty League, the Overwatch League, Apex Legends, you've seen these kind of professional organizations built around these games that are consumable in smaller
Right.
bite sizes.
And then now, if we were to think about a specific game, and Ilaria, I know you've got on the ground experience working in these type of games, but when you think about, okay, I have a game, I want to create some kind of esports structure around it, as far as like number of tournaments, prize pool, all that kind of stuff, all of the like the specific detail and logistics behind creating an esports program for a game. What goes through your head? How do you think about that?
How long is the podcast? How much time I have?
As much time as you want.
So, well, let's simplify by saying this. It all starts with your fans and your gamers.
Okay.
Your gamers, the core gamers, because that's where esports is going to appeal to, right? Obviously, they're going to tell you how much engagement they want, what kind of structure the tournament is going to have, or the tournaments if you're planning a whole season. You're going to know if you're a publisher, any big publisher knows very well who they are, where they are, when they play, how much they play. So those are the typical monthly active users, weekly, but also you'll know what's their level of interest in terms of the type of structure that you wanna create for the tournament. And I'm going even deeper at this point. It's like, let's say, okay, we want to create a season. Then you have to walk the fine line between creating content that is meaningful with games that are meaningful, because just because they're playing, it doesn't mean that people are going to watch, because once you're doing also sports, you're creating not only something for the fans, but you're creating a true entertainment product. So then you're subject to all the other variables of anyone. People getting bored, you're competing for attention. People could say, well, yeah, okay, cool, but I want to watch something else, or I want to play myself. I have only this much tolerance for watching other people playing. So then you have to really all the other things come into play. So tournament structure, with down to the rules. For example, are you doing a double elimination rule, for example, and that you have to consider. You're doing that. Well, then your tournament it's going to be your games are going to be fairly long. Your shows are going to be fairly long. Do you know if your audience can stick around for past like 4 hours? Esports shows tend to be very long, so that's why I'm saying. And then obviously try to create an engagement that goes parallel to the actual games. So you're creating a show, then you have to find a host. Streamers are super important. I remember somebody even mentioned in one of your previous podcasts, co-streamers. You want to have influencer. Gaming influencers are a
Right.
huge thing right now. They are able to drive, I wouldn't say more engagement than a company like Activision or EA, but almost as much. So you have to really keep them into your ecosystem, and then also work into obviously the social media channels. So there has to be something going on in the chat. You have to give maybe you want to also keep the engagement high with something that is like drops or some kind of campaign on Twitch that rewards people for watching. And companies are doing that too. So all these pieces have to come together for a show to be really compelling and having people say, okay, yeah, sure, I'll spend 4 hours watching this, even if I don't have, I'm not playing and I'm not going to win anything, but I'll get something out of it, even if it's just to watch my favorite esports player. And that's also why these people are extremely important. You have to make stars out of them. You have to build the show, maybe sometimes around them. And then in building a whole season, then you have to, like I was saying in the beginning, walk that fine line between pushing out a serious amount of games that obviously keeps the engagement high, but also not continuously push content out in a way that dilutes their value. And because you're ultimately creating a narrative that builds into whatever is the final price, right? Even for mobile esports, now the prices are like upwards of 1 million. So you have to build that sort of like expectation and interest that builds into the narrative in a way that you don't lose audience mid-season for whatever reason. And obviously, let's not forget one thing: all these sports seasons, whatever is the game, their goal is to really help sell the game. So, and like we were saying, Matthew was saying that before. So they're built around when the new game is coming, and around the physiological, I would say, normal curve that the engagement has after the game comes out, and then there's obviously a little bit of a dip. So the esports, whatever season is, has the goal of really keeping that engagement high, because you're gonna do live services, you're gonna do some other content that you're pushing out, but you want to keep that engagement consistent, knowing that the new game is gonna come out in a year or maybe even 2 years. So your esports season is really what is going to keep that engagement alive. Told you it was going to be a long answer. So.
Well, appreciate it. And maybe the one other follow-up there for prize pool is prize pool pretty arbitrary, or is there like some kind of formula that people are using to come up with the prize pool?
Well, for what I've seen and from my personal experience, it's kind of like there is a little of a wiggle room, but it's very little. It comes together as obviously what the company's willing to invest, what you get from sponsors, what if
Right.
you're working with an external
Sure.
organization for
Right. So it's
IP,
kind of
branding.
like budget as well as, kind of art, like what would feel good, that kind of thing.
Yes.
And then maybe like a more fundamental question, just kind of pulling back and kind of making this question more relevant for some of the game studios or game companies out there. So if you have a game, when should game developers think about, okay, I should start thinking about an esport or supporting esports for my game? Like at what level of scale or revenue or things like that? How do I think about when should I start developing something like this?
Well, I think if we that's a very good question, because if we look to the market, we see examples that, for example, as Riot Games, that they doubled down on esports since the game is released. So, for example, if you look to League of Legends, if you look to Valorant, even Wild Rift. So the most recent example could be, for example, Wild Rift, which was like released in some of markets in late 2020, but like globally more in 2021. It's already in 2022. They have like a super global with like a regional penetration for their esports. So they going with like North America, South Korea, Japan, China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Europe, Latin America. So it's all across the globe. But also, so I think there is not a specific, let's say, rule. I would say it's more about what Ilaria said. It's like if you first you have to understand your community, because there is not like 101 how to build a esports scene. It's not like, okay, let's see what EA, what Riot Games, or what Activision Blizzard is doing, and let's just copy and paste, and it's gonna work out. Because, well, when you analyze for the landscape, we're going to see there is like a variety of like formats of the how esports being run, and in almost all of them we have success. So I think in the recent years, Riot Games was the one who actually like changed how like the market in general. I would say the broader game market looked to esports, because they said, okay, we're going to double down, we're going to invest in esports because we believe can be a very good user acquisition tool for us. So they made the franchise league. The franchise league attracted investors. Investors attracted more players, more audience. So it created a hype and awareness around the league. After that, we saw a lot of publishers saying, "Okay, that's really good. I want that for my game." So instead of looking to the community, they just like copy and paste. And then we start seeing, okay, maybe franchise is not something that applies for every single game. But then we still have games even older than League of Legends. Let's say Counter Strike, that have when make a like one-on-one comparison, Counter Strike, League of Legends, they have a super different landscape for esports. One is super like publisher focused, while Counter Strike is super open and basically relies on third-party organizers to operate. But of course, Valve realized, okay, that esports making really well for me. So let me support a little bit. Let me give some financial support. Let me increase the price pool, because as you said, like I think the price pool, the players itself, even though if you're not like a Dota player that you're competing for a $40 million dollar price pool, you most likely the prize pool itself doesn't pay off. Like it's not a lot of money if you split in 6 and 7. That it's usually what esports teams does. So I think the prize pool, for example, is more a tool of like create awareness and actually to engage
Got
the
it.
audience. So what's
Yeah, I would just add. I'm sorry. I would just add that we've seen a lot of developers like Valorant from Riot recently, even Overwatch from Blizzard, right? When they or even like just thinking about these games and starting to develop them, esports is part of the core development process. They're thinking about how they integrate esports from the very beginning. And so I think, JK, just back to your original question, like I think if you're really trying to build a next big esports game, you really need to think about how it organically fits in with your game. Just like, live services, you don't kind of just say we're going to figure out live services when the game is done. Like it's something you think about along the way and it's part of your development process. I think esports is now in that same discussion. When you're designing the game, when you're thinking about the cadence, you're also thinking about how esports fits into your whole development plan. And I think more and more people are starting to do that. There's Playful Studios is now doing that with their game Wildcard, which is a blockchain Web3 game. We can talk about that later, but just how they're thinking about the fan engagement, how the esports is going to develop around it as part of the core development process. I think that's really something that's starting to be a big sea change, not just at the Blizzards and the Riots, but now at a lot more companies.
Ilaria, would you agree with that? Or do you guys have, I don't know if you can speak about it, specific things that you look for, or is it more about, to Matthew's point, when you're starting to build a game that kind of makes sense, that you start integrating it from the get-go?
Well, my personal experience, obviously, the company already had these sports seasons. So when I joined, so there
Okay.
is only this much that you can change due to contracts and agreements that are multi-year contracts, whether they're on contracts with ESPN or with FIFA or whatever. But obviously,
Sure.
I would say one thing: nothing is set in stone. You're following your fans, you're following the fandom, you're following your gamers. So things will change, and you have to be able to capture that and be able to modify even the season accordingly. So if something is happening, and we've seen it even with Ukraine, the war in Ukraine, or things that were happening in parts of the world where they're not exactly where our fans are, but they're close. So in a way or another, there is an impact, and you have to keep all these things into consideration. COVID was also obviously the other big thing. You can't have your star players fly, and that's a big problem when you have people playing from home.
Right.
Something I didn't mention before, but there's a whole layer of technical issues that comes into place, because you're capturing game feed and you're trying to put two players playing against each other in a way that obviously you're trying to control variables that you can't control completely, such as even their internet connection. Maybe it's bad. And what can you do? So you put them to play into a studio or in some hotel room or whatever. But what you're going to have to deal with is some delays between one player and the other, and you're trying to get the latency right for these shows. So usually these things happen on a local, to facilitate, you try to make it happen on a local level, so that they get attached to a server that is the same and it's close to them, as opposed to have a player playing from Australia and another
Right.
player playing from the UK, because that will create a
Right.
whole nother layer of issues for you as the publisher broadcasting that, and we don't want
Right.
to deal with that. So finally, COVID, I wouldn't say it's over, but at least we're dealing with it. So now you have your players flying and they're all in the same location. So that eliminates at least that. But other
Got
things
it.
can come into place, obviously, and you have to be able to really adjust the season and the tournaments based on that, based really on the response from the fans. That's why I was mentioning before, social, huge engagement there to be measured, and keep the pulse all the time there, because your fans are going to be, and gamers are those kinds of people that will tell you very straightforward when things are working or not. So you will hear directly from them and you'll know what directions to take.
Right. And maybe actually taking a step back, speaking of COVID, certainly many game companies were saved and saw a huge boost from COVID game content companies. Now, on the esports side, from a viewer perspective, there may have been a boost, but Ilaria, to your point, maybe on the content player side, there were certainly a number of challenges. Hugo, as you were looking at the market data, what were you seeing? What was the impact of COVID to kind of like the esports market overall?
Yeah, okay, yeah. So aside of all the technical difficulties that COVID brought to us, we definitely saw a spike in the year-over-year growth
Mhm.
from 2020 to 2021. And I think one of the simple way to say that is every other entertainment in shape or form got halted. So the only kind of entertainment socializing tool people had was like gaming and then watching people playing video games.
Yeah.
And but what is really cool for esport is not like, okay, once you engage, once you become aware of esport, you become an esport audience. It's not like, okay, now that all the restrictions are lifted, you will never ever see esports again. I think people are more open to watch esports. People are willing more to watch esports, even though in some of the cases those people who were, let's say, the enthusiasts, those that watch esports on a more regular basis, because now the restriction are lifted, they will become more occasional viewers. But I think in general, I think it was a really good way to advertise esports to a broader audience.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add, and this is not unique to esports, fandom is an emotional experience, right? Whether it's music, whether it's, movies or esports, once you start watching someone or a team and you start really building an emotional, attachment as a fan to that, that doesn't just go away because, live concerts are back, right? You're going to keep watching whatever you have an attachment to because you're now a fan and you have that emotional bond. And I think that's something that's very underappreciated when everyone just says, "Oh, we're going to go back to the way that things were." Well, that's not necessarily true because we've built different bonds and different attachments, just human nature and sociologically. And so when we look ahead, those bonds are there and they're not going away.
And to
Got
this
it.
point,
And maybe now, oh, sorry, go
I
ahead.
wanted to add just one quick thing. Even more,
Please.
when you have your star players in person, I worked with big games, and the professional esports player, the bigger ones, they're real stars in their own way, really. They have sponsors, they have their own social media managers. So seeing them in person all together, the whole team that flies, and even if it's, post COVID, we're still in the gray area. So maybe they're in a booth and separated from another team, but they're in an arena. There is lights, there is the whole stage, there is a host, there are people, providing commentary. All of that is finally happening in an arena, and these are big arenas. We know that esports events, they fill big arenas as much as any other sports event, and that really means for a lot of people really be able to see the techs of the world or all the other famous players. It really means keeping that engagement at a much higher level than seeing the same people but spread all in their rooms, and the host is in another location, and the the analysts are in another location. So it is really something that is building the engagement even higher, and we were all like very anxiously waiting for that because we knew that our fans really wanted to go back as much as we wanted. So it is something that, to Hugo's point, it's not at the end of the engagement. It's actually only going to go up from there. If it lasted so much and it was so strong through COVID, then it can really continue just on its way up.
Right. And maybe now kind of shifting the conversation to be more forward focused or future focused in terms of like emerging technology. So we have things like blockchain or metaverse, and Matthew, I think you're kind of deep on the metaverse side, or any other technology. How do you think these newer emerging technologies could somehow be integrated into esports? And if they were to be integrated, what kind of forms would that potentially take?
I mean, I can kick it off. I mentioned a game that's in development from called Wildcard from
Mhm.
Playful Studios. Again, we don't know what it's going to look like at the end because they're still making the game, but they're using blockchain to kind of embed the fan experience and the viewership actually is the gameplay. And so the CEO, Paul Bettner, on our podcast Into the Metaverse, kind of told us about, he grew up like with Pokemon, right? And you see like the Pokemon cartoons and there's like everyone in the arena and then there's all the action, right? And then when you play the game, it doesn't look like that. Well, what if the game actually looked like that? Like, what if you were able to be a fan and actually interact? That's part of the gameplay. And so they're trying to think about, how do we actually, instead of just sitting on Twitch and watching it where it doesn't interact with the gameplay, how can we put the fans as part of the core gameplay loop and then reward them for doing that, in this case with blockchain? And so, again, we'll see if it's successful or not, but I think that's a really cool idea to embed that fan experience as part of the core gameplay. And so we'll see where that comes. But I think what you're starting to see is people are trying to think about, how can we take these emotional bonds that are built because of esports and just fandom and make that more part of the core games. And I think that's what's exciting, whether it's in the metaverse or just using blockchain, whatever technology choice it's going to be. I just think how people are starting to rethink and think about different ways of engaging with fans. That's what's exciting.
Got it. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I would say, for example, I think here we would be cool to like kind of separate in two different boxes. I'd say, for example, if you think about new technologies in terms of like the game itself, I think to become esports, the first thing is people have to, like the players and also the viewers, they will watch a game that they understand that those are the top players and they are not the top payers. Because people want to watch those who are really good, who are mechanically good to play video games, not those who are really rich and buy the most expensive items. So I think for new technology, this is something we should see. So we can see, let's say, blockchain games become more popular as esports. But in terms of like new technologies, I think it's all about how those new technology will increase the fan experience. Because when you look to the new technology, there is a lot. For example, VR stadiums. There is also a lot of we could do, for example, with NFTs and blockchains, like some kind of like subscription program, some kind of like loyalty program through blockchain. But like the true question is, how will those solutions increase the immersion that the viewers and the fans have?
And I have just one thought
Okay.
on since Hugo
Sure.
mentioned NFTs. So, elephant in the room, right? NFTs are the big thing, especially for games. And we are all going to have to deal with it in a way or another, in some form. Now, obviously, I want to bring the publisher point of view as, sure, I'm going to have to deal with that, but I'm also going to face a lot of criticism in any possible way when we're talking about tokens. From concerned parents saying that it's like gambling or you're creating addiction or environmental concerns. So it's all going to be about finding if this is the way, and it is the way in the market, finding the right balance between really using that as an engagement tool, but using it with, a measure of, how can I say, equilibrium between wanting to keep a certain level of engagement, wanting to find if you were using blockchain, well, you're going to have to find a partner that is has a reputable experience and is also environmentally concerned enough to not attract more criticism. So you're going to have to deal with all these things if you have to. It's not just the decision about, okay, I want a token campaign. Let's activate it. That implies also, by the way, a lot of specific skill sets that a company needs to have, because these are all these campaigns that I mentioned, such as the Twitch Drops campaign. Those are all developer activated. So you have to do really you have to put some steps there, even in terms of content, in terms of promoting it on social, and you have to have the right people so that that really helps with the engagement and creates a whole fan experience, that the experience that we're talking about.
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
I'll just add that, I think, and this was kind of Hugo was making this point, right? Play to win has never been a successful mechanic for any game, right? Whether that's, a traditional multiplayer game, and there was a notorious game from Electronic Arts in 2016 that kind of got a lot of flack for this. Diablo 3 way back when got a lot of flack for this, and now it's play to earn games are getting flack for this. I mean, whatever the technology choice, play to play to win has really never been successful. Gamers don't like it. When they see people spending a lot of money to be the best, they get turned off by that, to Hugo's point about watching the best skill players who don't necessarily spend the most. And so I think as the narrative shifts away from play to earn, spending a lot of money to get ahead and hopefully cashing out for more than you put into, just rewarding engagement, rewarding players, rewarding with a sense of ownership in something, and whatever that looks like is to be determined, because people are still building this stuff. It's still very nascent. Then I think it starts to look like less like a financialization play to win mechanic and more like something that the average gamer will adopt. And that's when it gets exciting. And we're still a long ways away from getting there. But I think there's a lot of people that are working on how do we make this organic and not financialized. And then when we get there, I think that's when these technologies, rather than serving a niche crypto native audience, they serve a broader 3 billion plus gamer, or in the case of esports, 600 million, active esports viewer audience. And that's when I think it gets exciting.
Okay. And then is there, I know we talked about a number of new technologies and things like that, but any other trends or companies that we should be aware of that we haven't previously brought up yet?
Well, I would say, yeah, trends are there's a lot we could be talking, but I think one of the things that we increasingly will be more popular in esports, I think you also talked that in the previous podcast, is like a co-streaming. So how can you, because like it's all about like fandom, like is it worth to have your
Mhm.
official broadcast channel where you can control all the audience, you can make sure the sponsorship deliverables will be correctly done, or is it better to go diversify? It's better to have like famous content creators broadcasting your content in but like there is also a trade-off, but the trade-off of that is you either get more viewership, but also you start losing the full control of the picture, because well, what else if your tournament, for example, is sponsored with like a brand, and then the content creator is drinking the Z brand. So how can that affect the sponsorship value for esports? So I would say co-streaming and how that changes all the dynamic of like thinking about esports, think about of esports, but also how people watch esports is something we should be very looking close.
And so Hugo, just so I understand what you're talking about there by co-streaming, so it would be the same players in tournament, but like the commentators around it might be different. Like it would be different creators who commentate on the activities that happen, kind of similar to for Monday Night Football, Manning cast or something like that, where am I understanding that concept correctly?
Yeah. So basically, it's we have the official broadcast feed with
Mhm.
like official content, official commentators,
Right.
and we have content creators reacting on
Okay.
real time
Okay.
for in about that content.
Got it. Mhm.
One thing is, Joe, um, and for Hugo as well, as a from my insider point of view, you do use co-streamers, you do use usually gamers, influencers, previous esports players that are retired, as your co-streamers. As long as they're streaming live, whatever viewership they have, you can claim it as yours because the content is yours. So if they're streaming as much as you, as many people are tuning in to listen to influencer X, then these adds to your viewership. So because esports have their own set of viewership metrics, such as AMA, and that's the way success is calculated. For the lack of a better word, that's what defines success in a way. It's the viewership. It's the AMA. Sorry, it's average minute audience. So that's what obviously companies like EA or Activision they have to keep consistently high. And using co-streamers could be a good way, but also you leverage, you choose very carefully those co-streamers in a way that you want to, for example, build diversity. So why don't you use a woman, right? Full streamer, or you're streaming. Most likely, you're going to be streaming in English. Okay, so then let's say for a game that is very popular in Asia or in South America, you're going to use a co-streamer from those areas. So that will provide in a language commentary in a language that you are not, obviously you don't have maybe the bandwidth to take care of, because you can't hire a second host to do that, but you're going to have the co-streamers basically doing it for you. So all of that can come together in a very organic, very thoughtful way if it's done well. Also, Hugo, to your point, very good point on the branding and the drinking, the the bottle that is a different brand from what it's. Absolutely, I can tell you, all good esports organization will plan that in advance. Nothing that you see behind an esports player is by chance. Trust me, and because there are people like me doing that job and looking into that. So only certain amount, certain things are allowed, certain type of content is allowed, certain types of statements. Good companies, they pay a lot of attention into that, because whatever you're saying, whatever message you're sending, even nonverbal, is something that the company needs to be absolutely aware of and needs to be able to control. It's all part of the ecosystem. So obviously, I can see smaller companies not having the bandwidth to control all these things, but to Hugo's point, that they can create a lot of like snowballing into a lot of issues with sponsors if you don't pay attention to that. So, and maybe brings us to an earlier question. You were saying, when is the right time to have esports and uh, an esports tool basically to promote your game. And then I would say, when you have people who can do this type of job. So it's not really a specific moment, it's when you can do it well. And it might be very soon for you if that's what your focus is. If your marketing company, if your marketing business unit within the company is focused on that and believes in it, sure, then it might be sooner than for other companies. But all these variables you need to have skilled people to control all these things. And let's not also forget the problem of the game feed and getting the game feed in a way that is satisfactory for the show. So all these things, I think
Right.
these are the trends that we're really seeing. Your latest question, and one thing that is extremely important, and we haven't touched it, but it's cloud broadcast. So we are obviously broadcasting and leading into a situation that is way more complicated technically, but guarantees a better experience, which is cloud broadcast. So all the players in that field, players in the sense of business, will have to sort of deal with it in a way or another, whether it's internally building an internal capability or using a vendor. But that's where this type of broadcast is going.
Okay. So I have one last question, and that's basically more now around geography. So if you think about the differences in esports by different geographies, and like maybe are there similar characteristics of geographies or reasons why certain geographies would accept esports more than others? Or how would you think about different geographies when it comes to esports?
I would just say for people that haven't spent time in Asia, I was fortunate to spend a few years. JK, I know you spent some time
Yeah.
in China. If you haven't experienced what esports is like and as a culture in Asia, you should really check it out because I think in the West we have the benefit of having amazing content, traditional sports, but in parts of Asia, like China and Southeast Asia, esports is like one of the dominant, if not the dominant sports there. And so the whole culture around it is just absolutely insane in some senses relative to what you experience in other parts of the world. And so I would just say to anyone that hasn't even taken a look at that to go research that more because I was fortunate to be able to live in Hong Kong for 3 years and get to experience that. And I would just recommend for people that have a Western point of view to really take a look there.
Right. And Hugo, by the data, did you see any glaring discrepancies, or was it relatively
No, that's
similar?
that's quite interesting because that's definitely one of the trends we analyze. So kind of like the global against local, global versus local, because and this is definitely what Matthew
Mhm.
said. So because it's much more easy. So if you are a publisher or you're a tournament organizer and you're thinking about, okay, I want to build an esport tournament, I want to build a league. You definitely your first choice would be to go for one of the most developed markets because they are more profitable, right? and you either go to, let's say, NA or Europe or South Korea. But I think one of the challenge really is esports is becoming more global. Well, we in the recent years we have seen like organization traditional like American, South Koreans, and even Chinese going abroad. So if you look, for example, to the Brazilian market, you have like American teams and European teams. If you look to uh, Europe, you have like multiple American teams, but also Chinese teams operate in those regions. So I would say one of the challenges is to really understand you cannot like duplicate your winning local strategy to other regions because, well, for example, if you compare North America to Southeast Asia, for example, it's not like in Southeast Asia they are more mobile first. They prefer mobile gaming, but then in North America it's more they are more into like the PC. So Counter Strike, League of Legends, games like that will be more popular around esports fans. So I would say the challenge here is understanding that like it's not necessarily your winning strategy cannot be just duplicated to other regions because uh, the markets are different. People play different games. People play different genres. Even they watch in different platforms. And for example, is it for example, let's take China as an example. If you take to any Western people and say that in China, one of the things that they do in game live streaming platform is they have the bullet chat. You don't have like a straightforward chat in your left bar. You have the chat flying over your screen, and this is can you imagine create content? Can you imagine like I would take some Ilaria a thought here because can you imagine for a publisher to think about how to lay out, how to design the broadcast template? Imagine like memes and words will be flying over your screen. This is so more difficult, for example, for people who are super used to be more Western centric when they have to think, okay, let's go to Asia, and they will find some really local problems. I'm calling problems, but they are not problems because for in that specific market, that's how it's done. So I would say you really have to deep dive and understand. Even though we really like to say esports is global, every single market has its own way to do it.
Okay. Got it. Thank you very much. I think that was my last question. So unless there are any final comments or issues, I think that's it. Thank you so much. And for our audience, we will catch you next time. Thanks, everybody. Bye.